everyone for joining us today. My name's Charlotte and I run a charity called Carefree, which is a digital fund recipient. We're part of the Strand 2, so we're kind of a digital pioneer organisation. We didn't go on a digital transformation journey with our organisation. We started from that space about 3 years ago, and we've been scaling use of a lot of the methods that you would see in the startup sector today and trying to build that fusion of understanding of how you can apply that within the charity sector. So we have with us today Phoebe and Dama. Phoebe is our grant manager at the Digital Fund, but she's also a wonderful systems thinker involved with many initiatives trying to build a sense of how can we make the social sector ripe and ready for the internet age. And Dama is also with us from Bethnal Green Ventures today. So she's been working to scale a lot of tech for good initiatives, so sitting on that side of the spectrum of social purpose organisations. But previously has really deep experience from working with HealthAge International, which is a large international NGO, really kind of traditional within the charity sector. So was able to cover both sides of the coin for us. We have about 40 minutes now, and we're going to cover 3 topics. So we thought we'd start with, why is it important for charities to have a voice and a role in the 21st century? How can they stay relevant to developments in both tech and society? And what can we do to make sure that they've got the conditions that they need to make this transition? We will also be taking questions from the audience for the last 10 minutes. So if you want to put them in the chat box, my colleague Peter is going to ping them over to me at about 9:35. So I'm going to be keeping the speakers on track as we flow through. Just to say to everybody here, if there is anything that we haven't covered today, hopefully our contact details are on the Digi Leaders website, but I'm certainly very happy to answer any follow-up questions that people have if we don't get to them. Great, so kicking off with the why. Individual acts of charity have been present throughout our history. We've seen that evolve into a sector of its own with every industrial revolution to respond to what's been perceived as structural weaknesses within our society, working to protect the most vulnerable. But in today's world, there's much greater recognition for the collective responsibility that both businesses and the systems that we operate in have to create organisations that do fit for a sustainable future. Every business has to report on its social purpose. There's been the growth of the tech for good space, and charities are facing a little bit of an identity crisis. You know, on the one hand, we're not the only solution out there for doing good anymore, but we're also in a situation where we're perhaps not perceived as being the best response for some of the mammoth challenges that our society faces. So, Dama, I really wanted to start with you today. With all of the different types of social purpose organisations out there, do charities still have a role to play?
So I can answer that question with a resounding yes. I strongly, and maybe I should caveat this, so I am venture capitalist by background now, which is quite a different sort of dynamic, different space, very, very, very different sort of ways of working as well. But hopefully there are some insights that I can share as to why I still think charities are very relevant and very important. And that's not just only as a result of COVID-19, which has just exacerbated quite a lot of the inequalities that already exist and really highlighted the lack of social safety nets for the most vulnerable and the ones that are bearing the brunt of this crisis as well. So that there's already a necessity and a need for essential services that have traditionally been delivered by charities to ramp them up and to ensure that they are being delivered online as well, if safety permits, if there is a feasible way in ensuring that those type of services online will also be adopted by the most vulnerable in our society. But the main reason why I'm saying that charities are quite important is also that we are sort of working in a tech for good space that has different key stakeholders. And whilst my work primarily focuses on helping launch and scale tech for good businesses that are companies limited by shares and are trying to deliver on their purpose, on their mission to tackle social and environmental challenges, but also deliver financial returns to their investors. I do think that we do work in a space where we have the benefit of actually having a multitude of legal entities, a multitude of different types of organizations that just allow us to collaborate more effectively and to hold public entities, governments to account, because we still very much need this type of response. And I think charities in that space can definitely can ensure that we create that sort of enabling environment as well for more collective action and for more collaboration as well.
Yeah, enabling that amplifier effect. So taking what's being developed within the tech for good space and being able to shine a light on the charity sector for its place at the kind of the next level down in terms of really having its finger on the pulse of who needs what and in what way they need it delivered to them as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Phoebe, just looking at kind of Dama's kind of mentioned tech for good space, and the different legal entities that we have today and the for purpose, for profit. How do you feel that charities can respond to this challenge to their identity in terms of, if you want to do good, go and support a charity, changing to, if you want to do good, get involved with this impact initiative, and that kind of the strata that we're trying to cover here?
I would definitely, I really resonate with what Dama said, and I would kind of double click on that like absolutely yes, charities still have a role, and with this crisis to identity, I think I would flip that on its head, because I think we have such an opportunity as the charity sector to actually be able to experiment and innovate and really listen to users in a way that isn't kind of disrupted or interrupted by market forces or like the need to provide a return on investment. So I think there's a kind of reframe that is possible there, in that the charity sector has this opportunity to really experiment and innovate and support communities and people. And we've just seen that in the digital fund over the last 6 months with COVID. It's just been completely mind-boggling how much our grant holders have just like extremely rapidly adapted to the changing conditions and really shown that as a sector we can really pull together. I also think because of the conditions of the charity sector, in that it's not a competition for return on investment, for profits, there's a real opportunity to band together in really exciting collaborative ways and coordinate across the whole sector. And we've really seen that again at the lottery, that we've got one of our like main principles is generous leadership, and we've seen a ton of different examples of generous leadership within our cohort, whether it's one of our organizations, Refugee Action, creating a refugee tech handbook, or like hosting loads of events and webinars and supporting smaller organizations to band together and kind of coordinate across geographical, like local contexts, or whether that's trying to think like, a lot of our other grant holders have also been focusing on that ecosystem piece. So like Open Food Network, it's built into their whole value proposition that they're this kind of ecosystemic networked organization that is really responding to needs. So that's just to say that I think because charities are under very different pressures, they could use that to their advantage and actually play that card of like, we are a sector that works together, that's collaborative, that actually responds in this coordinated way.
I think traditionally it's been quite hard for charities to kind of look upwards and outwards. A lot of experience significant resource constraints. They're always kind of heads down, trying to do the best they can to deliver to what they're trying to do already. And one of the disadvantages that seems to have brought us in the how do we do it? How do we respond to the technological and social changes going on around us, has been that we're not necessarily as attuned to the kind of practices of always trying to achieve product market fit, and that within for those who haven't kind of come across this term before, within the tech sector is the idea that you are continually trying to read the market trend of what is it that's going to deliver the most value to your users, what's actually going to be something that's going to convert into user behavior. of kind of adopting your product, using it, and it becoming something where you've got repeat customer value from. And often the way that charities are engaging with their beneficiaries is that they might have a particular service or a particular program that's been, there was a grant proposal that was developed for it according to a fixed project plan. You're reporting on your monitoring evaluation outcomes, and it makes it quite hard for charities to take that kind of iterative journey that actually can prove very, very valuable for when you're trying to stay responsive to what's going on around you and make sure that your social intervention stays really relevant and attuned. So Phoebe, I'm going to come back to you again for this next question to probe a little bit deeper, but how have you seen some of the digital fund organisations adopt a digital approach and take that in closer to their operating framework within their organisations?
Yeah, so in the digital fund, we had two different strands of organisations that we funded. Strand one really focused on digital as a Trojan horse. So that's been a hypothesis for the digital fund, that we fund digital projects or digital transitions of organisations as a way for larger kind of systemic change, which is what really kind of excited me and attracted me to the whole mission of the digital fund. So Strand 1 organisations were given quite large, relatively large amounts of funding over quite a long period of time. So it was, and it was very flexible funding, and that's something we've heard back from grant holders has been totally invaluable, because it's given them that space and time to actually think strategically, to be able to, really listen to users, create prototypes, test those out with their beneficiaries, and then adapt. And Strand 2 was focused on supporting organisations like Carefree, or one of our Strand 2 charities, to scale existing platforms or services that had already shown, proven some sort of product market fit, I guess you could use that word, but shown a lot, uptake of users. And then that was, the funding was to scale that. So other organizations like Good Gym and Open Food Network, Open Food Network, over the months of the few months after the pandemic, experienced a 900% increase in users, and said, if we hadn't had our digital fund grant in place and had established those ways of working in that technical capacity, they wouldn't have been able to respond the way they did. So that's been really exciting. But just to go back to what I was talking about with the Strand 1 organizations, I think it's been really key at the beginning of the digital fund. Organizations weren't asked to provide a detailed plan in winning that grant funding. So in a way, it was a lot more similar to the traditional kind of private sector, where startups kind of try and get investment, and investors invest in the people. They don't, they invest in the project as well, but there is a focus on, this team has potential. They've found something really interesting. We're going to invest in this team long term, and then that team is able to use their skills and capacity to kind of prototype and build. And I think that's just so rare in the charity sector, as you say, Charlotte. If it's project, grant funding that is attached to a project and has KPIs, or it has metrics that are set at the beginning, well, the world is a complex, changing system, and trying to meet people's complex needs as conditions change. If, just to use the pandemic as a really obvious example, if you'd won project specific grant funding right before the pandemic, and then suddenly the pandemic hit, and you suddenly need to take all your services online, and you were previously a face-to-face service, that could have been completely disastrous for charities. So I just think the pandemic is a really good example of how having that flexible funding and actually having ways of working which allow you to be responsive, agile, iterative, networked, and able to be really kind of flexible in your approach is absolutely a kind of 21st century charity capacity.
And it takes a lot of bravery to go on that journey of the uncertainty of not having fixed outcomes, not knowing where something's going to go when you test it. You know, is it going to be a good idea? Or is it not going to be a good idea when you really put it in front of your users in a true and real way? And the other, you know, just kind of really hammering in on the how, and I'm going to come to you about this, Dama, is, you know, my perception is that for charities to be responsive, agile, develop these practices within their skill sets, there's also a journey to go on in terms of reforming their internal processes and practices. And you know, that's really speaks to you know, I guess you know, being able to uproot some parts of your organization and yeah, in order to be able to make it more efficient, more effective, save costs where you can, because there certainly are ways to use, for example, no code tools today to just automate a few systems, free up your workforce to do kind of frontline delivery in a far more active way. But, you know, I'm very mindful of the Bill Gates quote of, you know, technology applied to a crappy process will just enhance its crappiness. You know, how can charities seeking to apply technology to their social intervention make sure they're not going to stuff it up?
Yeah, I think one of the sort of key things, so when I sort of left the charity sector about a couple of years back, there was a lot of talk about like tech literacy and that we needed to invest into staff to develop their sort of technical skills as well. But I kind of feel like the conversation has now shifted because there are so many no-code tools available. If you want to build your website, do not get a bespoke website necessarily. Use open source CMS content management systems like WordPress. Use no-code tools like Squarespace or Tilda or Webflow. There's so many of them out there, and it's relatively easy to maintain without exorbitant sort of amounts of money that you have to spend for maintaining a bespoke content system. But what I want to say is that not necessarily the conversation has to shift towards investing in technical intuition. So upskilling staff to really understand how technical processes work. So there's a bit more of an interrogation when a tech piece is being developed or a product is being developed or a feature to a product is being upgraded, that people have enough of an understanding of what they need to interrogate and how they need to test it with their users in order to make sure that it's actually being adopted as well. So there's definitely there are amazing sort of initiatives that already exist, like Founders and Coders, who run a Tech for Better program, for example, who pair not just with charities, but with any type of social impact organization to help regular sort of staff employees who maybe have no relevance to product, but want to build a product in the future, to allow them to actually build that technical intuition with a 6-week course on how to do product management effectively by getting a paired up with developers who build the MVP or prototype for you. And that's such a helpful sort of understanding of what you need to then continue doing on building up on the product, because a lot of times we end up in conversations where we don't find any sort of scale up funding, where there's no grant funding or nothing, no money available to actually continue to maintain a particular service that has worked well and that you might want to elaborate on. So it definitely helps to sort of get a better sort of understanding of how tech development actually works. And that's a very easy win because there's so many resources out there. So it's a bit of time spent on upskilling charity workers as well as just such a helpful sort of first step. And then just sort of reiterating what Phoebe already said, if we leave room and budget to pivot, to be able to adapt relatively flexibly whenever we find a sort of barrier where tech adoption might not be the case, even in funding proposals, if we allocate just 5% or less, or up to 10% even in the budget to ensure that people can just pivot and have the space to really interrogate and critically think about how their services might have to change in order to actually be adopted effectively as well. That's already such a helpful step again to just ensure that services are being delivered. So yeah, I would say those are the main sort of common tips that I would have. The other thing is really to also look into open source technology, just because there is a tendency, if a service, if a company, for example, builds on open source technologies and has their entire code published on GitHub as well, there is a tendency, if they close down but the service was excellent, that you might want to sell the code on. You don't necessarily have to sell it, but you might want to pass the code on to another organization that is like-minded and continue that service for you. So there's also a sort of wider remit of actually enabling more people to build on the services that you create within in-house, and more of the nature of actually looking and collaborating with others in the field, which is so powerful and just ensures that we can continue delivering services to the ones who need it.
Yeah, it's really having a democratizing effect on the space, isn't it, to have this combination of open source code available to you and all of these kind of SaaS platforms and software tools that you can kind of plug and play into different parts of your operation.
Yeah,
I really want to come back round to something that you mentioned there about the lost potential to the sector of finding organisations that have proved that they've been doing a really powerful intervention, and yet when they come to that kind of point of they've got their evidence base, they're ready to scale, but there isn't an ecosystem out there to support them in terms of the funding space of that journey. Where, to what extent is that a problem? I'm very aware of the problem of, for example, we don't have a talent pipeline of new charities coming forwards, of people starting a digital charity that has that scale up potential, because your seed funding that you'd require for that is well over the kind of £25,000 that's the usual grant amount for a startup, a startup charity that's under 2 years of accounts. You really need to be able to hit an income level even from the beginning of 200,000 to 500,000. So looking at the problem from the two sides of, the beginnings of the journey of how can we, if we do need the charity sector to exist in the 21st century, how can we seed new initiatives, new pipeline of talent there? But equally, how can, as funders, and this question does go to both of you, how can we create a better funding ecosystem to make sure that we're able to capture that rather than to lose the potential of what people have started to create?
Who do you want to answer first?
Phoebe, do you want to dive in?
Sure. Yeah. I'm happy to. I think, again, I think there's just such a massive opportunity that I'm seeing between, there are movements that have been happening and around for a long time around ethical technology, open source, good data governance, and those are really established movements that also get funding for the kind of tech that they are pioneering. And then you've got the charity sector, which in a way is a movement of its own, in terms of we are here to try and help people and create products for good. So I love tech for good, but I feel there's also this opportunity for good tech for good, ethical tech for good, and that could attract funding, a different kind of funding, not just charity funding, or not just funding for things like Mozilla, but some sort of funding like a movement of values aligned, civic technology, tech that is actually living and breathing, or not living and breathing, but tech that has actually got those values baked in. So it's responsible technology, because that stuff is not being picked up by the private sector. You've got the big tech companies that, for them, it's not, they're not prioritizing values of user, protecting users and good data governance and privacy, and not using algorithms that, can lead to mental health issues, actually, and really, some really serious problems with the tech sector. So, to kind of answer your question, the kind of funding, I think we just need more funding, firstly. There's got to be more funding in, this Venn diagram of civic tech and charity, and charities and tech for good. And I think that funding needs to, as we've talked about, it needs to be flexible, it needs to be over multiple years. And I think, you know, one thing we've done in the digital fund is paired our funding with really close design, data and digital support. So not expecting charities to know how to not expecting them to know how to do user research or like these, you know, pick up these new ways of working. It's got to come with support, with upskilling, with training. And I think the talent pipeline is a really good point as well, Charlotte, because obviously in the tech sector, you know, a head of user research or like a CTO could be making kind of 6-figure salaries. So then we need to think about what is the incentive, what is our unique value proposition as the charity sector to people who may be in the tech sector and thinking about, you know, jumping across, and okay, maybe there's a salary decrease, but then what are we providing? Are we like a really supportive, inspiring, values-driven sector that's got lots of opportunities for support and working as part of an ecosystem and feeling part of a movement? And I think we've still got a lot we could do in terms of becoming more attractive as an alternative to big tech.
Thank you, Phoebe, because, you know, I have to say the last 12 months have been the most exciting from that regard, you know, with the work that Catalyst has done, now Dovetail and Cast. You know, there really is a much wider complement of support out there for organisations to be able to build what Dama said earlier about that kind of technical intuition and that feeling that we're not on this journey alone. Every charity is having to go through this process of reforming and reshaping its processes. And you know, I kind of shared this kind of stat with Dama and Phoebe yesterday that, you know, 4% of charities in the UK have an income of over 1 million, which is very small. I mean, £1 million if you're trying to deliver to 10,000 plus service users is still an incredibly small budget. But that 4% of charities takes up 87% of the sector's assets. Leaving the other 160,000 odd charities with very limited capital resources to be able to undertake this transition or to build their organisational resilience. And, you know, at the moment, the discussion, you know, or the kind of donor discussion I feel is about how do we get charities to undertake mergers and acquisitions? You know, how do we get, you know, we need fewer charities in the UK, rather than kind of, you know, focusing on how do we get better quality charities in the UK? How do we get, you know, fairer access to resources? How do we support collective knowledge building, which is what, you know, things like Catalyst is doing. But these are still very singular initiatives for an incredibly large market. And, you know, within the tech sector, you know, you might have 50 accelerators, you might have, you know, 200 venture capital funds, you know, just within one city. You know, for the charity sector, we just have 3 initiatives that, you know, are kind of the ones that are kind of taking on this challenge. And, you know, I really feel the weight that they are kind of that they're under. So, Dama, I wonder if you could speak to how does the kind of private sector and the VC space, you know, do this ecosystem building to make sure that, you know, there's the right kind of capital, the right kind of mentorship, the right kind of skills and knowledge base being developed?
Yeah, I'm happy to elaborate. I can't talk anymore. Elaborate on this. I also got to say English is not my first language, so pardon me. I just wanted to make a quick point just on what Phoebe said as well, on the sort of unique value proposition that the charity sector can bring across. One of the main reasons that I switched over to working for BGV as well, which I love to tell people more about. It's such a great place to work at. It's very, very inclusive as well. But one of the main reasons why I personally also felt the need to change industries into more social purpose driven for-profit companies was also the lack of sort of representation in the charity sector. So whatever effort is being taken to shape the 21st century charity sector as well also needs to take into account how we can drive more equity, diversity, inclusion in the space. So just wanted to make that note. But in terms of sort of a lot of practices that we've seen, especially with sort of how BGV operates, We've partnered with really amazing sort of charities and organizations in the past couple of years just to help sort of find a space and explore and learn from each other, but also explore how we can mutually support social tech and tech for good businesses that work particularly for the communities that they're trying to serve. So we had sort of partnerships with the Resolution Foundation, for example, which we're going to continue over the next couple of years, which was particularly looking into low-income workers and the gig economy, and the sort of with the sort of outcome of reducing poverty at the low-income sort of level as well, and elevating more workers to have fairer working conditions and decent working conditions as well, because quite of those sort of issues are rough and really outstanding and do not need to exist in this time and space. But one of the sort of beautiful sort of things that we've done together is to invest together into companies that are tackling these particular issues. So with Resolution Foundation, we've invested in five or six companies over the past couple of years, one of which it was so great to sort of see that they've gotten continued grant funding from Resolution Foundation, which enabled them to continue to build on their product more effectively. And that's a company called Organize, which is sort of a campaigns platform for collective action for low-income workers. And during the pandemic, they've gone from 80,000 members to, I believe now, more than 500,000, of which 50% are living on an income of less than 15K. So it's significantly targeting low-income workers as well. And that's mostly been enabled because from the get-go, from the inception of their business, they've designed their product with their users in mind and had a lot of room over 2 years to actually explore how they can really refine their product market fit and build their product so it's actually helping their users to enormous effect. They've had wonderful sort of campaigns that they've won against Amazon warehouses, for example, to ensure that people have more decent working conditions in warehouses, of actually taking regular breaks instead of having to pee in a bottle because they can't afford to lose times by sending out packages on a sort of band. They've had massive sort of success during the pandemic to ensure PPE equipment is being delivered to essential key workers as well. So it's great to sort of see how the fruits of the hard labor that both B2B and Resolution Foundation have put into place years and years ago has such a continued effect on our current world. But there's some really interesting sort of initiatives that have emerged in the past couple of years as well. With, for example, Nesta, we worked with them on the Future of News Fund that also looked into other legal entities, so not just charities and for-profit companies, but also co-ops and KICs around the country to sort of see how we can build sustainable journalism and more public interest news that is affecting the most marginalized communities in the UK as well, which is just such a great sort of statement on how we can actually build funding and particular pots of money to actually allow for this type of discovery and use more targeted user research as well, with the sort of view that not just one entity needs to exist in order to deliver these type of services, but it can be a co-dependent sort of wider ecosystem of different types of organizations that collaborate towards one common outcome, which is to make the world a better place. So there's loads and loads of examples that we can bring to this.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing is that combination of flexible patient capital, but also the kind of supportive relationship between the investor and the, for want of a better word, entrepreneur or the organization, on that journey and that level of kind of understanding that exists between the two on, you know, it's not about how many beneficiaries you're reaching within your first 6 months or your first year. It's about how many you're going to reach in 5 years' time based on what you've developed and what you've tested. I do want to be able to open this up for questions, and we've got 7 minutes left. So if anybody would like to post some questions in the box, please do. And Dama, I just want to ask you one other question, just to pick up on could you give us an example of where you've seen lost potential within the charity sector, where we haven't gotten it right, but we've actually managed to lose something that could have been a really powerful example of social change?
Yeah, I mean, when we sort of discussed this as well, I mentioned the Amnesty International example of the panic button. There's a really great blog post on the Engine Room as well that just talks about how they have developed a sort of product, a tech product that is essentially now the panic button in your phone, and how they've gone on to the journey of actually looking for funding, particularly to build this particular product. But made the very smart decision to actually retire any further development, because it was actually going to be integrated into your phone as a basic sort of functionality. But that's a really, really great example of how the charity sector can also talk more around their lessons learned and the sort of best practices as well, and also helps people to put tech development more into perspective of when do you actually need to make that decision to retire something because it just doesn't work. And we just need a bit more accountability from people in the sector as well, to be bold and really frank about these type of discussions as well. And I feel one of the things that I've learned in the VC industry, and that's something that has taken years for me to get familiar and okay with, is that a lot of collaboration just happens through mutual conversations. It is so easy for me to go to a competitor fund, but to be able to talk to those partners at that company, to be able to ask them about their deal flow, to be able to ask them about their companies and about how they deliver services to their stakeholders, and they'd be happy to share that type of information freely, even though they have an incentive to actually ensure that no one copies what they do. But just because there is that sort of mentality that you can share best practices and sort of the failures that you've come across as well more openly, I would love to see that in the charity sector, because there are groups like the Open Charity meetup, and obviously the Tech for Good meetup is a mixture of organizations as well, and CAST is helping to sort of ensure that there's always a charity perspective. But yeah, more accountability and radical openness would be great.
And being able to be truly networked, you know, I think this is you know, obviously there are many organisations covering a similar issue within the charity sector. You know, whether it's I don't know, with Carefree, we work with unpaid carers and supporting unpaid carers. You know, we want to be able to make sure that what we're doing marries with and ties into what everybody else is doing. And I feel, you know, I shared this with Phoebe and Dama yesterday, that what saddens me is how few charities seem to be confident and comfortable with, you know, the power of what they're doing, so that they feel in a safe space to be able to share those insights and not feel like they are exposing themselves in a dangerous way. And hopefully, with the way in which our society is evolving today, where we're all in it together with the kind of sustainability challenges that we're facing, people are much less afraid to share about what's going wrong, as much as they're kind of willing, they're wanting to kind of bring that best practice about what's going right. Thank you, everybody. I haven't seen any questions in the chat. Just having a look.
I haven't seen any either.
So I've got one from Peter on, is there any good examples of collaboration between charities and private companies at a deep level? So really co-designing around a project to bring the best qualities of each sector.
Dama, I feel like maybe this is I have more insight into.
I do think there were a few. So I think Alzheimer's, is it Alzheimer's Society? I believe it's Alzheimer's Society, don't quote me on this. But they've just started a sort of accelerator program that works with private sector companies who are building products that tackle sort of long-term care for people with dementia, suffering from dementia. Which is a really great sort of initiative. They've definitely been other examples that include sort of what Super Being Labs do, as an example. They trailblazers when it comes to working with charities and social impact organizations alike. Co-designing projects from the get-go, that's a bit harder to come by just because it requires a lot more commitment, but there's definitely examples of how Data Kind have worked on sort of data deep dives with both public sector organizations as well as corporate partners that were involved in the process as well. But I will follow up with this question. I will come back with an tangible example, hopefully.
That's wonderful, thank you. Well, I think we're at the end of our time now today. So just to kind of wrap up with kind of 3 key points I think that we've kind of come across. Firstly, the importance for all charities to try and find a way to build a digital approach into their operation to make their kind of impact both responsive and scalable in their delivery, whether it's moving things up or down to respond to pandemic times. How charities can really start to focus on their product market fit to get something that's going to be lasting and responsive to users, but also hopefully bring them a sustainable business model, and the collaboration work that they can do with other entities in both the tech for good space and the private sector to really amplify the impact of their skill set and combine that with private sector charities. The need for funding that is both flexible, patient, open to an iterative journey, and I would definitely add as a social entrepreneur at the level of financing that you need to be able to deliver a scalable tech intervention. And perhaps I think, Phoebe, you touched on this around the ethical values piece within civic tech, but we've certainly found that one of the best support entities that Digital Fund gave us was really looking at the responsible technology piece and building practices within our own organizations of what principles are we making these decisions around, or what are the intended or unintended consequences of us bringing in this feature or taking this position as an organization, and really being able to make sure that you're reinforcing your mission at every level of your organization as you go through those day-to-day decisions. So that's it from us today. If anybody would like to follow up with us, all our details are on the Digital Leaders talk, and thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone for coming.